older people. I'm 73. I'm part of the baby boom generation. I'm hoping that I'll have time to spend the next 10 to 15 years, because I just feel I'm just getting started in this space.
Well, there is a little boy inside here that still loves things like this.
Well, hello and welcome to the stream, an unscripted, unedited, free-flowing conversation featuring guests who reject the status quo with a bias for action in the world of water and beyond. My name is Tom Freyberg. I'm an environmental journalist and content creator specializing in water.
And I'm Will Sarney, a water strategy consultant and investor, doing my part to solve wicked water problems.
And a big thanks to our season sponsor, Acciona from Spain, as well as our impact partners for bringing you this episode. So today, to close out season 5, we are absolutely thrilled to bring you John Elkington and welcome him as a guest. One of the founders of the sustainability movement, entrepreneur, founding partner, and chief pollinator at Volans. Also the founder of ENDS, Environmental Data Services. He's served on over 70 boards, can you believe it? And authored 20 books, including Green Swans, as you can see from the well-annotated, bashed up copy here I have on my desk, which was on the shelf behind me. He's known as the godfather of sustainability, the ambassador of the future. And I even think that introduction probably doesn't do your legacy justice, John. So a big thank you for joining me and Will on the stream, and to closing out season 5 with a high. So yeah, thanks for joining us. Good to see you.
Well, as they say, no pressure. Tom, Will, thanks very much for the invitation. I'm genuinely looking forward to the conversation. I'm not an expert in anything, just to sort of get the public health disclosures out there, and I'm particularly not on water, but fascinated to see where the stream takes us.
Amazing. Well, we've got so much we want to sort of dive into, but I think maybe it's good to start with you, Will, because John's been quite a sort of inspiration to you back in your career, right, and your sort of path to tackle wicked problems. So I thought it'd be good to maybe start with that.
Don't lay the blame on me, Will.
Oh, no. I know you get asked this question all the time, but I want to frame it as a sort of very personal journey for me, and that I started my career doing environmental work. And, we talked about this, and, that move to really embracing sustainability, how little I understood about it at the time, was just this huge pivot in what I did. And it was really, I wouldn't say abandoning my identity, but it was certainly a move to embracing something that was really not baked at the time. And, for me, it was taking an environmental consulting firm and rebranding it and really scraping together projects that I could put under the umbrella of sustainability. Back when, you were really evangelizing the triple bottom line and what that meant, and, value creation and so on. And, a good friend of mine said that, I didn't have a P&L, I just had an L. And, but I was, determined. So for me, it was really an aha moment that everything I had done before was not in vain, but it was certainly not the future. So, and yet, yes, you take the credit and the blame for that. So kudos. But, that moment when you went from really seeing the world one way to seeing the world in a very different way. And then, something that Tom and I want to talk about is, well, what's the next phase in terms of sustainability, and where do you see it going, and so on. So maybe if you can just talk a little bit about that movement to the triple bottom line, and what you were seeing in the market in terms of traction.
Well, I do see sustainability going, but unlike many people who say, it's we've been there, we've done that, it's dead. I actually see it going forward. I think it's very much part of our collective future, and I sometimes say that it's a bit like liberty. It's a bit like some of these big democracy style concepts that we have. It's one of these terms that will be around for probably centuries if the English language survives. But to go, all these concepts go through their cycles, and they have their sort of up waves and down waves, and there's always a reaction when something sort of pushes robustly into the mainstream. And I think the problem with sustainability was that it did push, the language was being used a lot, but people didn't properly understand what they should have been meaning when they use that term. And you may know, but I mean, you mentioned the triple bottom line kindly, but in 2018, I did a product recall for that, and through the Harvard Business Review, and they told me it was the first time that any management concept had ever been recalled, and it didn't mean, and I think some people assumed that I was completely fed up with the idea and thought it was useless. I just thought it was being misused, and so it was trying to sort of focus a bit of attention on, if not that interpretation, then which.
That's pretty radical in terms of, a recall and clarification of how a concept and language is being used.
Well, it may sound radical, and a lot of what I do is not flowing from a really deeply understood, coherent theory of change. A lot of what I do is intuitive. I mean, and I just sensed, in the same way that when the triple bottom line came up in my brain in 1994, I'd been working on that area of need for 18 months up to that point, trying to nail why I didn't like, or why I wasn't totally satisfied with eco-efficiency, which was the notion that came out of companies like 3M and adopted by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and so on. And it wasn't that eco-efficiency was a bad idea. It didn't. There were all sorts of dimensions. It looked at financial, not economic. It certainly didn't cover the social side. And in the same way that was intuitive to some degree, the recall was as well. So for anyone who's looking for a deeply considered approach to life, look away at this point.
Well, that was a good warning. We'll add that label. Just running with the eco-efficiency deficiency, if you will. I think where we're at with sustainability strategy is still neglecting the S part of sustainability. So, environmental performance and social performance is really lagging. And even with environmental, there's, a great disparity on attention to topics and, issues in all of it. So, yeah, I mean, we're, sort of going through these different phases of, what's in vogue and what's easy to do, what's more challenging. But yeah, the S part is often neglected because it's too hard. I believe too hard.
I think it's really interesting. Sorry to cut you off, John. Just on that move, because it could be called a movement on that triple bottom line construct that you said you sort of working on for some time, and then to sort of have it recalled. Can you explain sort of and talk a bit about why did you see that kind of being not used and abused, but misused and misunderstood by a lot of companies? And that's actually, was there a sort of growing frustration before that 2018 recall? Because I still hear companies refer to it to this day very commonly, right? So.
Oh, but no, there are 6,000 plus B corporations out there completely sort of configured around the triple bottom line. What was interesting to me, and I'd worked with companies like Ford, Toyota, Volvo, and so on, and those companies know what a product recall is. It doesn't mean that you put a product or a technology or an idea on the spike. It means that you pull it back because there is some identified defect, with a Tesla Model 3 or whatever it happens to be. So you pull back 100,000 cars or whatever it is, you correct the problem, and then you put the thing back out on the road. And the intention always was to say, there's something not working here. I want to understand why. But it wasn't to say this is a stupid idea, end of story. And where we got to, again, after about 18 months, was to the point where we realized that the framework was not the problem. It was the mindset or the frame within which the framework was being applied. It may seem a bit complicated, but for example, when I did the triple bottom line, the following year I came up with people, planet, and profit, or prosperity, which is to simply say this was a popularization of the idea. So that was 3 Ps, and completely accidentally I got to 3 Rs, and the 3 Rs with the ending of the recall, if you like, was basically the message that for most of the history of the triple bottom line and the ideas that came from that, the double bottom line, shared value, blended value, ESG, and so on. And I agree, Will, that the S in ESG has often been silent, and I think there are many reasons for that. But one of which is it's intensely political. Doesn't mean it is important. We've got to address that, and we've got to do a lot more work in that space. But with the 3 Rs, just saying, we've operated largely within a responsibility framework, corporate responsibility, all of that good stuff. The problem is now, with whether it's COVID or whether it's the Ukrainian conflict or whatever it is, climate, as it starts to really get its teeth in, we've got a resilient set of issues which not effectively covered by much of what we're doing under that sustainability or triple bottom line heading. And if you're thinking about resilience, it's not just of the company, it's not just of its supply chain or the economy, it's our societies, it's of our water systems, it's of the biosphere, the climate, whatever. And the only way to guarantee, or at least ensure at a higher level of confidence, that you will have robust, resilient systems is to regenerate them. So the 3rd R was regeneration, and not just environmental, again, economic, social, environmental, but crucially political, which takes us back to the S in ESG.
Boy, I could not agree with you more on the tie-in between the S and the political challenges, and it's very much a third rail for companies that don't want to take it on. And I think it's time that they do, quite candidly, because they are a key stakeholder. They have a workforce, they have a customer base, they live in communities, and they need to pick a side. And I mean, if we really want to build that sustainable, resilient, equitable future, that's thriving, you have to pick a side, and you have to declare your values. A good friend of mine just wrote a book on innovation, and he was talking about, company values as a driver, as a key component of innovation. And I mean, not that I want to go down the political rabbit hole, being an American, but I do agree with you completely that I believe the S is neglected to a large degree because of the political tie-in, and also really the complexity of dealing with, social issues that are really much more challenging in a lot of ways than environmental issues.
But I think there's a good segue there, Will, because you mentioned in terms of the role of innovation within businesses, and sort of looking at various interviews and podcasts from yourself before, John. This quote that stuck with me was kind of many years ago when you were working with the big environmental campaign groups, and the view was from them is you need to sort of strap down businesses and almost regulate them and give them a slap on the wrist. And your view very much was, well, if you can involve businesses in that innovation investment side of, that's where you can bring them along the journey to really change. And that, I think, is a sort of sentence really stuck out for me. So could you maybe take us back to that kind of conversation you had, and also how you see the role of businesses and startups and innovation today in driving forward this sustainability movement?
Well, that's a big set of questions, Tom. But I mean,
it was a classic, more of a statement than a question. I know. Apologies.
Well, that particular conversation, which is probably 25 years ago now, was with Peter Melchett, who then ran Greenpeace in the UK. Right. And he was basically saying to me, you mentioned environmental data services, and I co-founded that in 1978, and we were trying to get business to pay attention to safety, health, environmental, these sorts of challenges and opportunities. And over time, I mentioned 3M earlier on. In 1975, they launched their pollution prevention pays campaign. Joe Ling, a vice president, was the architect of that there. And that was the moment where I became much more interested in tapping into the creative and innovative side of business thinking and the resources that business can mobilize. That doesn't mean that if there's criminal activity or criminal intent, that we shouldn't lock up executives or give punitive fines to companies. I absolutely think we have to, and more than we do at the moment. So I'm not saying this is either or. I'm just saying over time, unless and until we can switch on the right hand brain side of the brain or whatever it is, and really get people experimenting because they're interested rather than simply in pursuit of a single bottom line set of outcomes, because that's what they're incentivized to do. This isn't really going to take off. It's not going to develop its own momentum. It's not going to scale and replicate in the way that it ought to. So that's where that came from.
I agree with your point of view. For me, having done the vast majority of my work in the private sector, it was pretty clear if it didn't deliver business value, then it was not going to get done. And I think the definition of business value has changed to the point where leading companies recognize that environmental and social and governance issues drive business value, as opposed to a thing that just sits out on the side and you pay lip service to it.
Well, I think you've seen change in areas like sort of people have balanced scorecards, and now when I first came across them in the late 80s, early 90s, or actually even earlier than that, the environment wasn't there at all. Now it increasingly is, and you find in most major companies there are incentives for senior executives, which are often sort of up to 20% or more of their annual salaries and so on, paid in relation to, for example, climate-related activity and hopefully outcomes. So I think things have changed to some considerable degree, but I think we're only just beginning in this space. People are only just beginning to wake up, and it's partly generational shift. Most of the people I started out working with and trying to wake up to this sort of agenda are now either dead or retired. So it's almost several business generations from that point that we now find much younger people coming into the conversation who totally understand this is part of their remit, or should be. Their children are badgering them at the breakfast table or whatever. And the number of people who've told me that at senior levels is really quite considerable. But they don't yet totally know not only how they do it, but how they do it, back to your point, and make a profit and get sort of properly rewarded for doing that. And the problem with the social side is, environmental is difficult enough, but the social side, it's very hard to see very often the direct rewards that would come back into that sort of incentive structure, balanced scorecard or whatever. And that to some degree depends on government activity.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think, the linkage between addressing social issues and brand value is a way to make that link. And, you can quantify brand value as part of intangible value. I think that's an opportunity going forward. It is, taking a position, having a point of view, a commitment, those values, and understanding what it means for your workforce, the ability to recruit, the ability to retain talent, the ability to sell whatever you may sell. I see that as sort of part of the next phase going forward, making those very difficult linkages to outcomes. So sounds like a business opportunity, Tom. John?
It's interesting because I think I mentioned in an earlier conversation that I'd been in Paris with a group called EcoVadis, and I've worked since 2007. I've been on their scientific committee, and over that time they've gone from 3 people to 1,700 now, and that's basically engaging business where business increasingly finds itself, which is having its having these pressures that force it, business as customers, to go back through the supply chain and properly understand whether it's on carbon emissions or whatever it is, human rights or whatever, bribery and corruption, what's going deep down sort of at different levels of the company. Now, I think that's a necessary part of all of this, but I actually think what we now face is the need to structurally change capitalism, and that actually means a much deeper process. It doesn't mean that that isn't important. I wouldn't be involved if I didn't think it was. But for example, economics is profoundly flawed. Ever since Milton Friedman, who was a very bright man, but he set us on a very particular track, which has started to backfire seriously on our economies and to some degree and growing degree on our societies. So I think economics is somewhere we have to focus a great deal more attention, and that gets to then value and how you calculate value and how you create it and how you reward people who do create it over time. And unless and until we do some of that work, I think a lot of the stuff that we do downstream of that sort of side of things will be, if not blown away, actively sort of eroded. The outcomes we want to see, the benefits and so on, will be eroded by these deeper structural problems. I'm not trying to be discouraging. I'm certainly not trying to be pessimistic, but I think this is a structural systemic problem which we've got to go at as such. And that I don't think that's going to be done by the end of this decade.
That's not something that can change by next Tuesday, is it? Kind of a fundamental rethink of capitalism as we know it. So, but I think the point you mentioned there, John, around kind of younger professionals looking, and I think we recently did a sort of webinar around this in terms of the creating workforces of the future, but obviously as well the kind of labor gaps that are soon to kind of show their ugly heads in organizations where they're simply not recruiting fast enough compared to the amount of retired, experienced, very highly skilled engineers that are going to soon to retire. So, and we had a couple of young professionals on the panel, and part of what they said is, look, there's so much information available now that actually, young professionals are very savvy in researching companies and looking beyond the greenwash and actually finding companies with purpose that they want to align with to sort of have a fruitful career. So I think that plays a really important part in this as well.
I hope so. I feel that the young in the global north have been, they have a huge advantage in some ways over other parts of the world in terms of education and so on. But I think they've been hit quite hard by financial chaos and by COVID and so on. And they're going to be hit much, much harder by the climate emergency as it really builds. So I think we've got to focus disproportionate attention on young people and helping them to prepare for what comes next and enabling them to do that. But at the same time, I think we've got another problem or challenge or opportunity, if we choose to frame it that way, which is that older people, I'm 73, I'm part of the baby boom generation. I'm hoping that I'll have time to spend the next 10 to 15 years, because I just feel I'm just getting started in this space. But I look around at my age group and I see a bunch of people who think they've done what they were intended to do, are going to retire. As they retire, they become more conservative. They vote continuously. They become more conservative. They invest in business, but they want safer returns over a shorter time scale. So you've actually got a potentially malign set of impacts coming from that older generation. So we can't just focus on the young. We've actually got to go after the graying demographics as well. I'm looking at you, of course, as I said.
I don't know why. I thought you were looking at my background, although I did move the Spitfire. So
I wish you were back.
Well, it's sitting right next to me in a very safe place. I'm happy to take it out for the audience.
Take it out.
I think you should. Yeah,
let it whiz around our heads.
Yeah, you should fly it across the screen, Will, just as a demonstration.
Well, there is a little boy inside here that still loves things like this. So,
well, I also think it's a symbol in itself. It was an extraordinary act by an American woman to fund the development of an aircraft at a time when nobody really felt a need for that particular aircraft, but which then came in. And as I mentioned in an earlier conversation, my father was involved in the Battle of Britain as a fighter pilot, and he wasn't flying Spitfires then. But that plane did a huge amount over time to pivot a crucial conflict in global history. And I look back at it, and it's a beautiful piece of machinery, but there is a story underlying it, which I think actually also captures where we are now. And we're having to do, or having to think about doing, the impossible. And that at the time was, if not impossible, an extremely unlikely outcome in aviation design or aerospace design.
And it's still a beautiful, beautiful aircraft.
Yeah.
I mean, there are very few that are that stunning and that effective and that iconic.
But it's an interesting, that engine, the Merlin, we don't need to go into all this in great detail, but went into the Mustang. My father threw that with that. But I also asked him, what was your favorite plane ever? Expecting him to say the Spitfire, but he didn't. He said the Thunderbolt. American aircraft, very heavy duty. It brought back more pilots than any other aircraft ever. Certainly during the Second World War. But the incredibly critical element was mass production. And the Thunderbolts were coming off production lines at the most astonishing rate. And that's what beat the opposition in that particular game. And here we are again with the question of how do we scale up production of things that we actually need, whether it's solar panels or windmills or electric vehicles or whatever it happens to be. So I think there are deep stories there, lessons.
I agree with you completely. Well, we could talk about airplanes for quite a while. Which
we've lost the audience already, but
but I want to talk about a sort of a related item that you brought up, in that you're talking about sustainability in waves, and that moment in time when you recognize that eco-efficiency was at best part of the story, part of the value proposition. And in a prior conversation, you brought up the structure of scientific revolutions.
Yeah.
And that conversation prompted me to go back and start reading it again. But in some ways, I could see the movement of sustainability within that construct of,
totally.
When eco-efficiency started, it was, evolutionary. Sustainability came along, and that was a real fundamental shift in how, the public sector, the private sector, and civil society thinks about things, the E and the S. So what's the next sort of shift in your mind, if you believe that, every several decades there's a revolution in scientific thinking, and has it tie into sustainability? And we probably just killed the audience with my sort of ramble at that moment. I'll show you the airplane again if that's helpful to the audience at all.
You'd have to put the sound in there as well. But let me try and respond. Yes, I've tracked since 1994 a series of societal pressure waves starting in 1960. To your point about they come along every so many decades, that used to be true, but they're actually coming in a shorter and shorter tempo now. They're actually building off each other, and I think the most recent period in all of this, I'm actually sort of almost calling not a wave, because it's almost like a flood. It's like the Babel flood. It's where everyone wants to be involved. They all want their own language. They all want their jargon and branding and so on. And so you just got this cacophony of different concepts. And I think, like the pushback against woke, like the pushback against ESG, particularly in the United States, this is actually not welcome, but it's actually inevitable. And I think it's a good sign, because it means that what we've been doing over the last years and decades is now coming properly into the mainstream. It's recognized to be having profound implications for sunk vested interest, sunk capital, all of this sort of stuff. And people are beginning to wake up to the fact that this is going to cost them. And if they don't move quickly, well, and so the politics, I think, of just getting started, I think they get brutal and quite nasty at times, but that's what always happens. So we've got to be prepared to fight that one, but with the confidence that at the other side, there's a very good chance that stuff that we've been talking about for a very long time will increasingly become a reality, not a utopian reality, but reality that billions of people over time will come to inhabit.
That's a really good point about it's now mainstream, and that's why we're seeing pushback and tension. I will say, John, that now my sons know what I do for a living. After a very long period of time of no one could explain what Dad did. So yeah.
Well, I think that's a shared problem. I mean, I just very quickly, but it was helped out in my case by the fact that my youngest daughter, who didn't really get what I did for a very long time, was lifted bodily out of the waves off Baja California by a whale shark, and came back semi-transformed. And 3 weeks later, Gaia, who's our oldest daughter, happened to be swimming. She was hitchhiking across the Scotland. And was off on an island off the west coast, went swimming, and a small island, she took off all her clothes and then banged into a basking shark. So within 3 weeks, 2 daughters were taken in hand by sharks and helped see the light. So I recommend that. I mean, it's almost my prescription for turning people around. A bit of time with the sharks.
I'll let you know how it plays out with my 3 sons, John.
Good luck.
Yeah, definitely.
John, something we want to sort of, I guess, conclude the episode with is, as I mentioned during the introduction, obviously you've achieved so much. You mentioned you're now at 73 years of age, from authoring 20 books to creating this movement. And on this podcast, we have a lot of serial entrepreneurs, and you could say sort of people who are deemed successful. I think something that I'd love to explore and just get your take on is, for some people, it's sort of when people look externally at them, they think, wow, they've achieved so much. But actually, this individual would say, I don't feel like I've kind of got going, or I've not warmed up. I haven't achieved what I want to achieve. So I'd love to know, sort of, you mentioned the next sort of decade of your focus is. Do you look back and think, actually, yeah, I'm just getting warmed up here? To everyone else, it's like you are like the North Star in the sustainability movement, and you've achieved so much. I'd love to get your sort of personal take to.
I genuinely think that this is the very beginning of all of this. I very often in Silicon Valley, as you know, they quote the old Hemingway line, gradually then suddenly. And I think in that world where we've left action, coherent, effective, timely action, so long that the solutions are going to come through very, very dramatically. I think the US Inflation Reduction Act is one early example of that. It sent absolute shockwaves through Europe that thought it was in the lead and all of that. So I do think genuinely that I'm just getting started in all this. I'm absolutely compulsively driven to learn, and to also to get myself into spaces where I don't know what I'm doing, where I'm having to learn by doing. If ever I get to the stage of thinking I know what I'm meant to be doing and how to do it, I'm sort of migrating to the next. I've set up 4 companies since 1978. They all still exist. The third one, sustainability, when we set that up in 1987, people had never heard the word. We were literally spelling it for 3 to 4 years for people. Now it's everywhere. But I think that's just first stage of the first game of a very long set or whatever. And now it gets really exciting, but it also gets really complicated, because as this concept mainstreams, it takes on the political colorations and inflections of every party, because suddenly everyone's interested. They all want to be involved, as I said earlier on. So I think it's a multi-generational challenge. So it's not going to be done by the end of this decade. It's not going to be done by the end of the century. It's going to be characteristic of our life as a species on this planet. But what fun! I mean, what an extraordinary time to be alive and all of this. And although many things are still going in the wrong direction, the potential for really quite dramatic change, I think, is higher than it certainly ever has been in my lifetime. So that's my delusion of the moment.
I love it.
I love how it ended very optimistically, and I think what a call to arms to be part of that change, right? To sort of for current generations to help pivot to a more sustainable planet. I think it's an incredibly powerful movement and thing for people to get behind. So John, thanks so much for joining us. I think we should actually agree to have you back on in another 10 years time to ask that same question.
Yep.
When you're 83, to think about the next 10 years on from then. To sort of, I'd love to do that. But really appreciate your time, and Will, final sort of closing comments and remarks from you.
A big thanks for being on, but a bigger thanks for what you've done. And I mean that very sincerely. You're either to blame or get credit for my life at this moment in time. So no burden there, John. But no, seriously, keep doing what you're doing. Really.
I don't know the alternative, Will, and both to you and Tom. I mean, huge thanks for the interest. Huge thanks for the conversation. If anyone's sort of still listening and wants to be in touch, my email is john@volans.com. I answer all emails. So, but I've really enjoyed the exchange, and I hope it won't be an entire decade until we get together again. And I hope I make it.
Oh, no. We won't wait that long, promise. Well, thanks again. Really appreciate it. It was good fun.
And now we can go off screen and look at the Spitfire again. Thank you.
I've got two, so
let's bring it in, Will.
All right,
great.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Appreciate it. Thank you, John.